If you're buying a graphics card a while after launch, you should not go by launch reviews because, for example, the 6700 XT reference model, which I have here, came out at $479. The RTX 3060 Ti Founders Edition that I have right here came out with a $399 MSRP. However, this is still hard to find at that MSRP. It's usually higher, and this one is now significantly below its MSRP, and not only that, it's actually cheaper than the 3060 Ti. Not only that, but performance changes over time with graphics drivers updates, games come out, new games, new game engines. Also, I've enabled Smart Access Memory and ResizeBAR. Nvidia now has some ResizeBAR support in certain titles that have been whitelisted, whereas they didn't when these cards launched. Let's jump into tests of the latest games on the latest drivers, with and without ray tracing, with upscaling, on, off, all of that. Tons of benchmarks head-to-head, and the 1080p and 1440p, and then at the end, I'll give you some final thoughts on which GPU I think you should buy. For our updated 2023 testing, I thought we'd start out with Unreal Engine 5.1 and go pretty in-depth here because so many new games are going to be using Unreal Engine 5. However, for now, we are limited to Fortnite for testing the new features like Lumen and Nanite and virtual shadow maps, because Epic develops Fortnite and Unreal Engine 5, so their game is the first one to get all of these features implemented. Here, we are looking at 1080p at the Epic settings. However, I have not yet enabled hardware-accelerated ray tracing. The Lumen lighting system is a software-based ray tracing system, but can be hardware-accelerated to improve accuracy, although with a hit to performance cost. Here, with hardware RT off, we're seeing the 6700 XT with a 14% lead over the 3060 Ti, so AMD having a good showing here. If you're looking at the frame rate counters, at the one on the left is the current frame rate, the one in the middle is the average for the duration of the benchmark run, and the one on the right is the 1% lows. So what we can do, though, is turn on the hardware acceleration portion of the ray tracing and see how much AMD's performance falls off when this is enabled, because that is one of the advantages for Nvidia's architecture over AMD's, is they lose less performance when enabling hardware-accelerated ray tracing, which is what we see here. And now the GPUs are pretty much tied for the averages, although I will note that if you watch the 1% lows, the AMD GPU is a little bit of a lead here. And actually, if you watch the frame time graphs for the smoothness, it's a little bit less spiky for the AMD GPU, which is interesting. Now, I will mention that the hardware-accelerated ray tracing in Unreal Engine 5 is not particularly demanding. So the AMD GPUs don't lose as much performance relative to Nvidia as they do in more demanding titles, which we'll look at a future portion in this video. But this is basically, this is maximum settings 1080p, Epic settings with the hardware RT on. Now, neither of them were getting a 60 FPS lock there at those settings, so let's adjust the settings a little bit here. If we go down to the high preset, we still have Lumen, Nanite, and virtual shadow maps enabled. It's just that Lumen and virtual shadow maps get turned down to the high setting rather than the Epic setting. At these settings, both GPUs are well over 60. The 3060 Ti is over 80 FPS. The 6700 XT is closing in on 100 FPS average, and the 6700 XT has actually increased its lead to 21% over the 3060 Ti. And I think this is more how most people would actually want to use these GPUs in this game, although there's enough headroom to enable the hardware accelerated ray tracing setting again. When we do that, the 6700 XT again loses about 15% of its performance lead, but since it had a larger lead at these settings baseline, that means it is still actually winning by 5% overall on the averages. And if we look at the overall frame rates, both GPUs are doing well here with a 76 FPS average on the 3060 Ti and an 80 FPS average on the 6700 XT. The 1% lows on the 6700 XT up around 68 with a 58 on the 3060 Ti. Now, let's jump up to 1440p because these GPUs certainly had a lot of headroom at 1080p, maybe not at absolute max settings, but at good settings. And here, notice that the lighting looks slightly different. I'm using the replay feature in Fortnite to benchmark it, and I think the sun position was not locked, which is annoying. We're seeing the 3060 Ti with the 6% lead here. This is the 1440p EPIC settings with hardware ray tracing on. So completely maxed out with the hardware accelerated ray tracing at 1440p. The 3060 Ti has a 60% lead, although I don't think you'd want to use either GPU at these settings, both of them averaging in the mid 30 FPS range with 1% lows dipping into the upper 20s. So I think this is just a sign that you're not going to be absolutely maxing out every game at 1440p on these GPUs in Unreal Engine 5. Now, if we go down to the high settings at 1440p and we turn the hardware accelerated ray tracing off, which still keeps us Lumen with the software-based solution, the 6700 XT now has a 12% lead over the 3060 Ti, and it's averaging in the mid-60 FPS range, while the 3060 Ti is averaging in the upper 50s, so not getting that 60 FPS lock. And if you look at the 1% lows, there's an even bigger gap there, with a 56 on the 6700 XT and 46 on the 3060 Ti for the 1% lows, which definitely matter in a game like this. And if you watch the frame time graph, it does just look a bit smoother on the 6700 XT. I don't think this is related to the VRAM capacity though, because if you look at the VRAM, the memory allocation versus usage, neither of those things are going over the 8GB limit on the 3060 Ti. Now, I did want to look at, okay, so what if the 3060 Ti did want to get over 60 FPS at 1440p here? Well, that's where you could kick on DLSS. So here we're at the 1440p high settings, and we had enough headroom that I did enable the hardware accelerated ray tracing this time. And using DLSS at the quality setting, which looks pretty good here, the 3060 Ti is now averaging in the upper 70s. And on the 6700 XT, I used TSR, Temporal Super Resolution, which is the Unreal Engine 5 temporal upscaler. This game doesn't have FSR implemented at this point. And at those settings, the 6700 XT matches the performance, although I do think the image quality of DLSS is superior to TSR here. But again, very similar performance, although the 1% lows were still a lead for the 6700 XT. But let's do a more in-depth look at ray tracing. I like to use Cyberpunk 2077 as my main ray tracing benchmark because as a variety of presets, we're starting here at the ray tracing low settings, which are just enabling local shadows. So this is basically the ultra preset, but then with the local shadows enabled. Also, the presets enable upscaling by default, and I have turned that off. So this is native 1080p. With ray tracing low preset. And here the GPUs are basically tied, although the 3060 Ti does have a 3% lead. I think when you have less than a 5% lead one way or the other, you're really not going to be able to notice the performance difference in actual use case when you're not running a frame rate counter. So I would basically call it a tie. And this is also what we were seeing in Unreal Engine 5, which is that when we hardware accelerated the Lumen ray tracing, we saw these GPUs come out roughly tied. So in lighter ray tracing workloads, the 6700 XT does seem to come out even with the 3060 Ti. However, when we kick up to the ray tracing medium preset, we see a completely different story, with the 3060 Ti now at a 26% lead over the 6700 XT. In Cyberpunk, this preset keeps the local shadows, but also enables ray traced sun shadows, and it enables the lighting to the medium setting. So we get more of the ray traced bounce lighting happening here. And it does look quite nice, although the performance impact overall to both GPUs is quite significant, with the 3060 Ti now well under 50 FPS much of the time, with 1% lows around 40, and the 6700 XT now averaging below 40 FPS with 1% lows around 31. So not a great situation for either of them, and this is where you have to question how much the ray tracing lead matters when the overall performance drops pretty low, although upscaling is an option, although at 1080p, I personally don't really prefer to do that. However, I did test that out here when we went up to the Ray Tracing Ultra preset. So Ray Tracing Ultra keeps the local shadows, sun shadows, adds in reflections, and it cranks the lighting up to the ultra setting rather than the medium setting. So lots of ray tracing going on here. And now At the 1080p native, the 3060 Ti has a 44% lead over the 6700 XT, but it's only averaging, in the mid to upper 30 FPS range, whereas the 6700 XT is actually averaging well below 30 FPS. So you couldn't even do a 30 FPS lock at the native 1080p on the 6700 XT. If we enable upscaling with DLSS or FSR2, I'm using the respective upscalers here at the quality setting because I think that's how people would actually use them. The 3060 Ti has a 40% lead and is now averaging over 60 FPS, so very, very playable, with the 6700 XT in the mid-40s. So the thing here is that the 3060 Ti is going to be very usable with heavy ray tracing at 1080p if you're willing to upscale. The question is, are you willing to upscale at 1080p? And I think many people would be, although personally I feel like it doesn't look great, and I would seriously consider just turning off ray tracing and playing at native 1080p Ultra, which is what we're going to look at now. At native 1080p Ultra, we're seeing the GPUs again, basically tied, although the 6700 XT has a 5% lead, which, like I said, I would usually consider pretty much a tie, because without running a frame rate counter, you're probably going to have a very similar experience and would be tough to tell the difference. So we're not seeing as large of a lead without ray tracing on here as we saw in games like in Unreal Engine 5 with Fortnite. So, different games, different engines get us different results, and in this one, we're definitely seeing a much closer result for both GPUs. Also, if you're watching the temperatures, this is the reference model 6700 XT and the Nvidia Founders Edition 3060 Ti, so neither one of them has an amazing cooler, so the temps are a little bit high on both of these GPU models. When I wanted to test out 1440p, I decided to show you guys, I did test out ultra settings, but I thought I'd show you the high settings because I think they made more sense. At the ultra settings, neither GPU was averaging 60 FPS, which in a first-person shooter I thought was pretty relevant. At 1440p at the high settings, though, the 3060 Ti does average around 60 FPS, and the 6700 XT is more up into the mid-60 range, with a 6% lead over the 3060 Ti. So we will call this one a win for the 6700 XT, but a very small one. It did pass up my somewhat arbitrary, it's better than 5% lead number. But anyway, I think that both of these GPUs are usable at 1440p, but like I said, reducing settings down to high and or upscaling is usually going to be the way to go when you're using these GPUs at 1440p in graphically demanding titles. But in some new graphically demanding titles, you might run into a VRAM issue. Now, I have not seen a lot of this, but I thought I'd bring it up. And you'll see this testing looks a little bit different here because I didn't have time to rerun these benchmarks. This is taken from my day one coverage of Hogwarts Legacy on a variety of GPUs. But it's the 3060 Ti on the left, the 6700 XT on the right. And while I haven't synced up the footage perfectly, they're both running up and down the same street in Hogsmeade. But you'll notice that while the 3060 Ti can average in the mid-60s like the 6700 XT does, watch the frame rate counter drop down to 30 FPS right here and then kind of come back up. And what seems to be happening here is the VRAM spilling over. And this is an issue in Hogwarts Legacy. It's not an issue in a lot of other games, but something to keep in mind is that 8 gigabytes of VRAM versus 12 could cause issues in certain games that use a lot of VRAM. However, other brand new games coming straight from PS5 exclusive, like Returnal here, don't seem to be showing excessive amounts of VRAM usage. This is Returnal at the 1080p Epic settings, and here, again, they're basically tied with the 5% lead going to the 6700 XT. I really like Returnal, by the way. I'm going to just plug this and say, if you're at all interested in roguelike games, meaning when you die, your progress resets and the maps are somewhat randomly generated, but there is some permanent progress progression in terms of item unlocks and things like that. I think this is a really good game that just didn't seem to get a lot of interest or sales, but anyway, just throwing that out there. If we go up to the 1440p Epic settings, we once again see basically a tie with a 5% lead going to the 6700 XT. But once again, I don't think if you turned the frame rate counters off, you had two PCs side by side, one with each GPU, you'd really notice which one you were using. The averages are in the mid 60 range. So, by this point in the benchmark run, by the way, you'll notice the progress counter. I'm not showing you guys the full benchmark run. This is a fairly long benchmark run. But in another plug for this game, it has a really good benchmark and it gives you really good stats at the end. It's really cool. And it's showing us the VRAM usage, RAM utilization, all of that. It's pretty interesting stuff. Anyway, the 3060 Ti averaging around 66 and the 6700 XT averaging around 69. Nice FPS. But let's jump up to a game where there is a more noticeable performance difference between the two GPUs with Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2. Now, I test out this game at the balanced settings rather than the extreme settings because this is a competitive multiplayer game. And I think most people who play competitive multiplayer shooters reduce settings from the maximum in order to gain a frame rate advantage for that competitive edge. So I think this represents realistic use case more than if I left it at the extreme settings. In this game, at 1080p balanced, we're seeing a 22% lead for the 3060 Ti. So definitely our best showing so far, and this is not uncommon in Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2 when testing AMD versus Nvidia. This game tends to be an outlier in the favor of AMD, but I include it in my testing because while it's an outlier to the average performance, it's a popular game that many people will care about their performance in. A lot of people who play competitive games have one game that they spend pretty much all of their game time playing, and if you are somebody who's playing Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2 or Warzone 2, which uses the same engine, but the Battle Royale version is harder to test, this is the built-in benchmark run that the game offers that we're showing here. At 1440p balanced, we actually see the 6700 XT slightly increase its lead to 25% over the 3060 Ti. So very interesting stuff here. And again, I can't tell you why this game favors AMD so heavily, but this is consistent across all of my testing. Whenever I'm comparing two GPUs that usually perform similarly, the lead goes to AMD in this title, which I think, in a competitive game where frames win games, that is definitely something to take of note. And so if you're spending most of your time in Modern Warfare 2 or Warzone 2, that might help your GPU purchasing decision right there. However, if we jump to Plague Tale Requiem at 1080p Ultra, this is not an Unreal Engine game. This one is an in-house engine developed by Asobo Studios, and this game looks great. Honestly, what we're seeing here, the face work on the characters, is one of the least impressive parts of the game. The overall lighting looks great. Here we see a basic tie, the 3060 Ti with a 3% lead, and both of them averaging in the mid-70s through that benchmark run, although in actual gameplay you'll be much closer to 60 FPS and even dropping below in the more demanding scenes. This game can be very demanding. If we jump up to 1440p, I actually reduced all the way down to medium settings to get better frame rates, and at these settings the GPUs are actually tied. And here I don't see any big differences in the 1% lows or anything like that either. This game is an Nvidia-sponsored title and does have ray tracing shadows available. I just chose not to use the ray trace shadows in the testing here, given the performance was already fairly low, and I'm honestly just not blown away by ray traced shadows personally, and we did a lot of in-depth ray tracing testing already in this video. Now, if we jump over to the Callisto protocol, which is an AMD-sponsored title, interestingly, we see the 3060 Ti give one of its largest performance leads. However, with a 16% lead through this benchmark run, this is the built-in benchmark the game offers. And I will mention that this game does use Unreal Engine 4, which does tend to be a bit NVIDIA-favored performance-wise off of the baseline averages, which is one of the reasons why I was so interested to see Unreal Engine 5 actually having a complete performance swing here, where, again, without ray tracing enabled, like we are here, we saw the 6700 XT with the noticeable lead, whereas in this game we're seeing the 3060 Ti with the noticeable lead, although when I jumped to 1440p, I reduced the settings down to medium in order to have this corridor of death, which just absolutely tanks frame rate, actually keep the frame rate somewhat reasonable. And at these settings, the 3060 Ti only has a 5% lead. So kind of interesting there, going up to the higher resolution but reduced settings, seeing a pretty big change in the GPU performance relative one to the other. So that's another thing where when you look at GPUs, you're just like, which one's better? Well, you know, depending on the game, the workload, the exact resolution settings you're using, all of that, we can see it just varies wildly. If we jump into Forza Horizon 5 at the 1440p extreme settings, we see basically a tie. It's a 1% lead for the 6700 XT. One reason I wanted to include this game in my testing, despite it being not quite as new as some of the other games, is because this is a big change from last time I tested these GPUs, where AMD had a large advantage here, because AMD has always supported smart access memory in this game, whereas Nvidia had not originally whitelisted resizable bar support for their Nvidia GPUs. But I think it was back in October of 2022 where Nvidia got an update where more games, including this one, did get that resized bar whitelist, and it made a big difference and had them catch up in performance. And speaking of basically tied performance, but in a brand new game, the newest game on my list is Atomic Heart, which I think looks great. The dialogue is less great, but well, I mean, maybe, you know, if you are into the maybe Duke Nukem style of humor, you would enjoy it. But whatever, the GPUs are what we're testing here, not the game. And the 3060 Ti has a 3% lead at 1080p Atomic, which is the max settings, and both GPUs getting a good frame rate average here with around 80 for the 3060 Ti and around 78 on the 6700 XT. If we increase it to 1440p at the Atomic settings, we're now seeing it actually exactly tied. If you look at, you know, the 1% lows, there might be like a 1 FPS difference, not that big of a deal. And they're both averaging right around 62 FPS through this intro scene. And I think this game looks quite good considering the performance that it offers here. So yeah, I wish more games were optimized like this one. Let's talk about which one you should buy. So the 6700 XT is about $360 right now on the cheapest models, and there's multiple available, $370 if you take a step up on several more models. The 3060 Ti, by the way, I'm using PC Part Picker just to look at, they survey and I'm sorting prices low to high, and this is what I could buy right now. They survey a lot of the major retailers, so it's giving you a good idea of what the new pricing of these GPUs would be if I wanted to buy them today. And if I wanted to buy a 3060 Ti today, brand new, it would cost around $420 for the cheapest models and go up to $450 quickly after that. So it does look like the 6700 XT is significantly cheaper. And I also want to point out that in the meantime, AMD has actually refreshed the 6700 XT with a 6750 XT, which I did not review in this video because I don't actually own one, but those are currently coming in with the cheapest models at $380. Now, a lot of times they're coming in at $400 or more, which is why I don't usually recommend them. However, well, let me mention why. Because it's only about 5 to 8% faster, depending on which review you look at, compared to the base model 6700 XT. So if the price is 10% more or more than 10% more than a base model 6700 XT, then it just doesn't make much sense from a price to performance standpoint. However, if it's $370 versus the base model's $360, then I do think it's worth it. So I do want to mention that today, those are priced close enough that you would seriously consider the 6750 XT, but I don't think that's always or even usually the case. Anyway, just throwing that out there. So throw that into the mix. If you add on a 5 to 8% performance tick up on all my 6700 XT results in this video, that's roughly what the 6750 XT would do. It's just a 6700 XT with slightly faster memory, basically. Anyway, so which one should you buy? Well, first, let's just say, which one would I rather have without factoring in the price? And I think I have a different answer at different resolutions. If I was buying these GPUs for 1440p, regardless of, let's just say they cost the same, I would rather have the 6700 XT, even if they cost the same. And if it's already cheaper, then I think that just sweetens the deal. Now, why is that the case? Because at 1440p, I'm more concerned about the 8 gigabytes of VRAM on the 3060 Ti, for one thing. Having the extra 4 gigabytes or 50% more VRAM on the 6700 XT is more relevant at higher resolutions. The higher resolution you're at, the more VRAM the game uses. It's that simple. Now, that's not the only reason why I do prefer the 6700 XT at 1440p. The other reason is because I don't care as much at ray tracing at 1440p on these GPUs, because I think, well, the 3060 Ti has a ray tracing advantage. I think both of these GPUs are weak enough at 1440p, not unusable, but weak enough at 1440p that I would rather turn down settings and maybe even use upscaling in order to reach frame rate targets that I would be happy with, rather than cranking up the settings by enabling ray tracing. So I think the ray tracing lead is less relevant at 1440p because I'd be less likely to use it at 1440p. So for those two reasons, I would prefer the 6700 XT at 1440p. Slightly faster at rasterization for the most part, although tied a lot of the time, more VRAM, I'm not that likely to use ray tracing. The one edge I'll give to the 3060 Ti at 1440p is I do think DLSS 2 looks better than FSR 2. So I think that's an advantage there. And then there's all of the non-gaming reasons like productivity workloads, where a lot of times Nvidia is better supported, things like that. And then there's reputations for things like the drivers, which is hard for a reviewer to quantify, but you can read online all about people's thoughts on those. Now let's talk 1080p. At 1080p, even if these both cost the same, I think I would rather have the 3060 Ti. And the reason is at 1080p, I'm less concerned about 8 gigabytes of VRAM. Now, I'm not guaranteeing you that no game will ever require more than 8 gigabytes, at 1080p. I think there will be games that might have issues with 8 gigabytes maxed out at 1080p, but I just think it's going to be much less frequent of an issue in any recent, any games coming up in the next couple of years. I'm not saying there won't be any, but I don't think it'll be that common. The other thing is, I think at 1080p, the performance is better than it is at 1440p, which means there might be more frequently headroom to use ray tracing. And if you're using ray tracing, then the 3060 Ti usually has a noticeable advantage. And when you're not using ray tracing, I think in many games, the performance is pretty similar overall, so you're not losing too much, usually, on the non-ray trace performance. So, and then Nvidia does, like I said, have other, benefits regarding a lot of productivity apps are better supported on it, things like that. Anyway, my game video here is mostly focusing on the gaming performance. So because I'd be more likely to use ray tracing at 1080p and I'm less concerned about the VRAM, and then one other thing, upscaling. I mentioned that I think DLSS 2 looks better than FSR 2 at 1440p, but it's a small difference. At 1080p, I think the difference is more noticeable. I don't really like upscaling at 1080p at all, but when I do, I find DLSS to be much less bad looking, if I want to put it that way. I think at the lower resolutions or more aggressive settings, FSR 2 falls off a bit compared to DLSS in image quality. So I think the upscaling is more usable at 1080p. The ray tracing is more likely to be used at 1080p, so that advantage is more worthwhile. And I think the disadvantage in VRAM is less noticeable. So if they cost the same, I think I would rather have the 3060 Ti at 1080p. So I'd rather have the 6700 XT at 1440p. I'd rather have the 3060 Ti at 1080p. But I'll be honest, on both of those choices, it's not a strong preference. And I could see somebody wanting to go the other way on either of those. And I don't think there's a bad choice either way, but that's without factoring in the pricing. If you then factor in the pricing, the 6700 XT just costs less. So with that in mind, I think you might want to choose it anyway at both resolutions if price is more of an issue for you. If price is less of an issue for you, I mean, honestly, guys, just buy the best GPU you can afford. And so, I mean, if, gaming's a big deal to you and you want the best, performance on your gaming PC, like, you just throw more money at the GPU if it's not a big deal. If money is a big deal to you, then I think having, what is it right now, a $60 advantage for the 6700 XT costing less here, I think that's a pretty big deal. And like I said, right now, even the 6750 XT is actually less than the 3060 Ti. And that adds on enough extra performance that I'd honestly probably just choose the 6750 XT at these current prices, if you can get that one at 380. Anyway, what do you guys think? Like I said, I think these are very close in performance with strengths and weaknesses. 3060 Ti, better ray tracing performance, better upscaling. 6700 XT, better price, and more VRAM. What do you guys think in the comments section? I hope all of you have an excellent day.